I've just been reading some of your writings, and one of the first things that occurred to my mind when you were writing about Accrual was, in fact, the work of Frances A. Yates on In the Art of Memory, where she's talking about the beginnings of rhetoric and refers to quintillion and how people would in fact establish the art of memory as a imagination, as a conceptualisation of a series of rooms, if you like, containers within a containers, and in each room there would be locked a particular piece of your argument or a particular truth, and in revealing your speech or in delivering your speech you would in your mind cognitively visit and travel through that structure, just grabbing a particular truth to deliver or reveal. What I think is happening in your music, however, is something very opposite when you're talking about accrual, because to my mind you're not thinking about the addition of containers, or if you like boxes, each of which is bounding a particular truth or something that's axiomatic to your music. You're taking things in a completely different direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because this idea of spatial separation as a way of thinking about rhetoric and having different boxes of containing different conceptual objects is interesting, because it implies that a segregation of that kind of difference of identity, of different zones, is permissible. So what I'm more interested in doing is, I think I used the word hybridization as a way of describing what I do. So I take the idea that taking different states, different material concepts, different bits of sonic substance, and colliding them together and allowing their identities to entwine to create that grey space between the segregated areas. So if you like, what I'm trying to do is pull to the surface, to sort of foreground within my work, the innate ambiguity of difference.
I like the fact that you're utilising the word surface for a number of reasons, but what I wonder is whether or not the surface for you is it's the location of that grey space where the interchanges that produce the hybridity that you're referring to happen.
Where I think about it isn't so much about encapsulated locations, boxes to put things in, but more to do with a sort of a dimension of space, a sort of a plane of operation in which to work musically. So that the surface is, for me, the felt interface between the sort of subsurface identity of the material emanating through the surface into what is heard. So it becomes a sort of an entwined fabric of layers, this bubbling, textured surface of the music.
And the way you're gesturing there and gesticulating with your hands and your fingers, there's a sense to me that when you're talking about the surface and its materiality, it's actually something that you grapple in, it's something that you probe, your fingers go inside. In fact, it's possibly not only possessing materiality, but the surface has a certain kind of density as well. So where does it begin and end?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also, this issue of tactility and kineticism is innate to that sort of fabric that I work with. So quite a lot of the way that I think about the substance of music, these ideas of material identity, is to think about it not in terms of pitches and notes and rhythms, but also to think about it as a sort of pseudo-kinetic textural behaviour. So the music is in a state of motion. It's about the sort of tactility of the surface, and it's about my interaction with that. It's thinking about music more as a behavioural organism, musical material more as a behavioural organism than it is the sum of its parts. And that's something that I feel that once you've got this organism in motion, then it becomes something that's kinetic and tactile, and that's something that I can then interact with to create these hybridizations that I'm talking about.
I went to a really beautiful talk not so long ago at an anthropological conference in Manchester, and somebody was referring to their work both with taxidermy and flat tin soldiers of, I think, the 18th century. But I think, if I remember correctly, there was a reference possibly passing in that talk where the person spoke about surface's volume.
Mm-hmm.
And coincidentally, on the same day, there was the most graphic and terrible image on the front page of The Guardian of a polar bear that had actually died, it had starved to death, and so one had the sense of the animal, but its volume had collapsed and its skin had caved in. So what that brought home to me, I think, when I was thinking about that day, was the idea that behind surfaces, the things that animate any particular surface is a volume, and that is what makes gives a kind of animation to how we might think about processes which occur on the surface. So it's not just a flat representation or a copy of something that's gone before, but there's something happening in the volume, however obscured it is, however encrusted, which, to use one of your words, it is, but the things that press behind or give little convolutions or folds, if you like, are also really important.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things there. I mean, I think that one of the things that's really interests me about that kind of notion is the idea that, like you say, surface as container, and a word that I like to use for that is to think of it like an interface, and the interface between the enclosed and the non-enclosed. It's the encapsulation of the space, and so for me that means that it's actually a sort of, that's what I mean when I'm talking about a plane of operation between the sort of identity forces of that which is enclosed broadcasting out through the surface, and then also the broadcast inwards of the totality of the encapsulated whole. And I find that really, really interesting, the sort of interface, bidirectional nature of that way of thinking. But also I think, just sort of pulling out of the abstract, one of the things I think is interesting is, you know, the idea of surface and as an intrinsic state of ambiguity. So if you think about the surface produced physically by a sheet of glass, that has certain identifiable characteristics, but those characteristics are only dependent on the perspective by which that object or that surface is viewed. If you put a pane of glass under a microscope, it becomes almost tactilically a different substance.
Level of magnification.
Absolutely, it depends on the perspective that you look at it. So the surface is not what I'm trying to render visceral in my musical surfaces is this ambiguity of that surface, in that there are forces moving in both directions through and across it.
But another things layer onto that glass surface. So, for instance, it might be breath, it might be soot, it might be, I don't know, some kind of matter carried in the air that deposits there. So you have this process of incrustation, to use your word again.
Yeah.
So how does that work for you compositionally in your music? What are the key things for you when you consider encrusting a musical object? How do you go about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think where I think about incrustation is the idea of compositation, to make composite. Compositing, I suppose, is a better word. The idea that you take different identities that can then, or material substances, that can serve to affect one another through their collision together. So what you're actually doing is, in my way of thinking about it, you're bringing the two together and entwining them, so that if you think about it back in terms of surface, rather than it just being this presented as a sort of one-dimensional space, it becomes a hybrid identity brought together by things.
So it's that intertwining, if you like, that process whereby elements are brought together so they become in some ways mutually constitutive.
Yes.
That they somehow create each other.
Yes.
That is what's key to you.
Yes. But also, what I find fascinating is that actually to encrust, to accrue identity and to add things is actually at one and the same time moving in the opposite direction. So for example, one of the things that I do quite often in my instrumental work is to do quite simple ways of dividing up issues of instrumental physicality. So I look at, for example, on the guitar, the right and left hands as separate objects with their own kinetic behaviours. Now, lots of other composers have explored the possibility of segregating those things in much more extreme ways than what I harness that power for. But then what I do is in treating them separately in compositional space and colliding the material, behavioural gestures that I set up separately in, say, the two hands, what actually happens is that they combine and erode each other in the act of encrustation, in the gestures colliding to form the composite. It also takes away from attributes of the original identities at one and the same time as encrusting each other to form this more holistic behavioural hybrid identity.
So how might that work here?
Well,
how might we collide properties or aspects of this gestures his hand might make with this that takes away from the other?
It actually works on a really simple kind of level. So what I might design is a behavioural system to control the movements of your left hand. So that might move control a way of moving both up and down the strings from the lowest to the highest this way, and also a certain set of behavioural characteristics moving up and down the fretboard this way.
Right.
But that's not something. So that's not something that I set up in any kind of tablature-based way. I create maps of the instruments and then work at the hand across the instrument.
Right. Okay.
And then, and quite often where I execute that is by defining those properties as statistical likelihoods. So the leap introduced up and down the fingerboard by the fretboard by the left hand will have a certain average size, but there will be other sizes that are permissible with that. They're just more unlikely to occur.
Right. And then, how does that interact in the ways you're talking about with the right hand?
So the right hand will have a similarly defined behavioural identity, which could be certain plucking patterns, it could be certain combinations of strings that are being plucked at any one time, or more complicated versions thereof. And then when the two are put together, what happens is that the behavioural identity of this combines with that, but they also erode each other. So for example, if you are busy creating very frenetic material on certain strings up here, but the behavioural identity of this is actually effectively blocking those motions by not plucking the relevant string, then that part of that behaviour will be edited by this hand, so that it's taken out. Does that make sense?
Let's see.